At 41, Prince Harry stands at a strange crossroads. Not young enough to blame impulsiveness, not old enough to hide behind nostalgia. This is the age when reflection hits harder than ambition, when the stories you've told yourself begin to crack, and when the silence you once used for survival starts to feel like suffocation. For years, the public was fed a clean, polished narrative, a modern love story, a couple against the world, two outsiders battling an ancient institution. It was dramatic. It was emotional. It was cinematic. But here's the question no one wanted to ask out loud. What if the real fracture didn't come from the palace? What if it came from inside the marriage? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is not a story about certainty. It's a story about whispers, patterns, timing, human behavior, and a silence that lasted far too long to be meaningless. Because when someone finally breaks their silence at 41, it's rarely impulsive. It's calculated, or exhausted, or both. And when Prince Harry finally allowed certain things to be implied, rather than denied, it sent shockwaves through circles that had grown very comfortable behind closed doors. Let's rewind. For a long time, Harry's life was defined by noise. Cameras, headlines, statements, lawsuits, public speeches that sounded rehearsed but carried visible strain. Yet beneath all that noise, there was one thing he never addressed directly. The dynamic. Not the monarchy, not the media, not even his family. The dynamic between Meghan Markle and a man whose name kept appearing quietly, persistently, almost inconveniently, in the background. Markus Anderson. To the casual observer, Markus was just another social connector. A fixer. A behind-the-scenes operator who knew everyone and belonged everywhere without ever being fully seen. The kind of man who never seeks the spotlight, but somehow always has access to it. But in certain circles, his name carried weight. And in Harry's world, his presence raised eyebrows long before it raised questions. At first, everything looked normal. That's how these stories always begin. Nothing dramatic, nothing scandalous, just proximity, familiarity, shared spaces, shared trust. But let me ask you something. How many relationships collapse overnight? Almost none. They erode. Quietly. Slowly. With moments you ignore, because confronting them feels worse than pretending they don't exist. For years, Harry presented a united front. Loyal. Protective. Sometimes aggressively so. And that's important. Because people don't usually defend something that fiercely unless they're trying to convince themselves as much as the public. Watch old footage carefully. Not the speeches. The pauses. The glances. The moments where his energy shifts when certain names or topics are brought up. There's something else people missed. Harry didn't just look angry at the world. He often looked conflicted, as if he was fighting two battles at once. One against external enemies, and another he never named. And that's where the silence becomes suspicious. Because silence can mean many things. Fear, denial, protection, or waiting until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Here's where timing matters. Harry didn't break his silence at 30, or 35, or even 38. He waited until 41, an age when men often reassess everything. Identity, loyalty, legacy, what they've lost, what they've tolerated. Ask yourself this. Why now? Why allow certain implications to surface after years of rigid narrative control? Some say it's pressure. Others say it's exhaustion. And some insiders, speaking cautiously, always cautiously, suggest it's because Harry finally realized that silence was no longer protecting him. It was protecting everyone else. And that realization can be devastating. Because when you look back and connect dots you once refused to see, the betrayal doesn't feel sudden. It feels cumulative. Markus Anderson was never just a random name. He wasn't a tabloid invention. He was present early. He stayed present. And unlike many people who drift in and out of celebrity lives, he didn't disappear when things got messy. That alone raises questions. Why do some people remain constant when everything else changes? Is it loyalty or leverage? Now, let's be very clear. No one is presenting courtroom evidence here. This is not a conviction. It's an examination of behavior, proximity, timing, and silence. Allegations, speculation, and interpretation, nothing more. But stories like this don't survive on proof alone. They survive on patterns. And the pattern here is hard to ignore. For years, Harry redirected anger outward. At the press, at his family, at the institution. But notice what he didn't do. He never fully explained the internal fractures. He never clarified why certain people seemed untouchable. And he never directly addressed why his emotional energy shifted so dramatically over time. That kind of omission is rarely accidental. Imagine living in a world where everyone around you knows something you're trying not to know, where conversations stop when you enter a room, where reassurance feels rehearsed, where your intuition whispers, but your loyalty screams louder. What would you do? Would you confront it head-on and risk blowing up your entire life? Or would you bury it under bigger battles, lawsuits, public crusades, ideological wars, anything to avoid looking inward? For a long time, Harry chose the second option. And that choice may have cost him more than anyone realizes. Because here's the part that makes this story uncomfortable. If the rumors are even partially true, then this wasn't just about romance or attraction. It was about emotional alignment, trust, access, influence. Affairs don't always start with touch. They often start with understanding, shared jokes, shared grievances, private validation, someone who listens when your partner feels distant, someone who becomes indispensable without ever being obvious. And once that line is crossed, even emotionally, it's very hard to uncross it. People close to the situation have long hinted that Harry felt increasingly isolated, not just from his family, but within his own marriage. That's a very different kind of loneliness. Being alone is painful. Being alone while partnered is devastating. And yet, publicly, Harry doubled down. Which brings us back to the silence. Why protect a narrative that was allegedly unraveling behind the scenes? Because breaking it would mean admitting not just betrayal, but misjudgment. And for someone who sacrificed everything for a relationship, that admission is almost unbearable. So Harry waited. He waited while tension built. He waited while rumors circulated. He waited while his own emotional state deteriorated. Until one day, waiting became heavier than speaking. And when he finally spoke, or allowed certain truths to surface, he didn't do it explosively. He didn't name names. He didn't shout. He implied. And implication is far more powerful than accusation. Because implication invites questions. And once questions start, they don't stop. The public heard something new in his tone. Not rage. Not defensiveness. Resignation. The sound of someone who has replayed the past too many times to ignore it anymore. At 41, Harry isn't trying to win battles. He's trying to understand what he lost. And this is where the story truly begins. Because the deeper you look into the Meghan Markle dynamic, the more complicated it becomes. Not dramatic on the surface, not scandalous in obvious ways, but quietly intense. And Harry, whether by choice or by emotional paralysis, stood at the center of it, watching pieces move without fully understanding the game. Until he did. And when that realization allegedly hit, it didn't arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a series of memories snapping into focus. And once that happens, there's no going back. Because the next chapter isn't about rumors. It's about the man Harry avoided talking about. And why his presence mattered far more than anyone realized. Because before the rumors, before the whispered allegations, before the name Markus Anderson became loaded with implication, there was a long, unsettling quiet. Prince Harry didn't wake up one morning and decide to question his marriage. That's not how emotional earthquakes work. They start as tremors. Small shifts you dismiss. Moments you explain away because acknowledging them would require tearing down everything you've built. And Harry had built a lot. A new country, a new identity, a new narrative that framed him as the protector, the rescuer, the husband who gave up everything for love. Ask yourself this. How do you admit something might be wrong when your entire public existence depends on insisting that it isn't? That's the paradox Harry lived inside for years. From the outside, it looked like constant motion. Lawsuits, speeches, podcasts, interviews, public battles that painted him as defiant and energized. But insiders describe something very different behind closed doors. They describe stillness, withdrawal, long silences where there used to be humor, and a man who seemed perpetually distracted, as if his attention was split between the room he was in and another conversation happening only in his head. That's often the first sign. Not anger, not accusations, but absence. When someone is physically present but emotionally unreachable, it usually means they're processing something they don't yet have language for. Harry's silence wasn't passive. It was active restraint, because silence can be a strategy. Early on, Harry was still fighting external enemies. The press, the palace, anyone who questioned his choices. And as long as he could direct his frustration outward, he didn't have to look inward. But the problem with external battles is that they eventually run out of enemies. And when they do, you're left alone with your thoughts. Friends who drifted away noticed it first. According to people who spent time around Harry during the early post-royal years, there was a noticeable change in how he engaged. He listened less, smiled less, reacted slower. Not depressed exactly, but guarded, as if he was constantly weighing what to say and what to suppress. And here's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because silence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in contrast. Harry wasn't silent about everything. He spoke openly about trauma, about his mother, about grievances with his family, about the pain of feeling unheard. So why avoid certain topics? Why never clarify certain relationships? Why allow speculation to fester instead of shutting it down cleanly? That kind of selective silence invites questions. And the questions only grow louder when certain names keep reappearing without explanation. Markus Anderson's name didn't dominate headlines. It didn't need to. It lived in the margins. Mentioned casually. Dismissed quickly. Always present, never central. That's often where the most important characters hide. People who knew Harry well say he didn't initially view Markus as a threat. In fact, early on, Markus represented something Harry didn't have much experience with. Someone who moved effortlessly through elite spaces without being consumed by them. Markus wasn't royal, wasn't media, wasn't family. He was something else entirely. A connector. Someone who knew how to make people feel seen, important, understood. Someone who thrived in private rooms rather than public stages. And for Meghan, Markus was familiar long before Harry ever was. That matters. Because when two people share history, they also share context. Jokes that don't need explaining. References that don't include you. A shorthand that can feel intimate even when nothing physical is happening. Harry, at first, welcomed that familiarity. Or at least tolerated it. Why wouldn't he? He trusted his wife. He trusted the world he was being introduced into. And more than anything, he wanted stability after years of chaos. But stability built on avoidance is fragile. And the cracks didn't show all at once. They appeared in moments. Moments where conversations stopped abruptly. Moments where laughter felt forced. Moments where Harry would enter a room and sense that something had shifted just before he arrived. If you've ever felt that, you know how unsettling it is. You can't accuse anyone of anything. You can't even articulate what's wrong. You just know you're not fully inside the circle anymore. And that's where Harry found himself. Inside his marriage, but increasingly outside certain dynamics. Now let's slow this down. Because this chapter isn't about jumping to conclusions. It's about emotional sequencing. Harry didn't suspect an affair, not at first. That word carries too much weight. Too much finality. People don't leap there unless something undeniable forces them to. What Harry felt was displacement. A subtle but persistent sense that someone else understood his wife in ways he no longer did. And that's a dangerous realization for any marriage. Especially one already under intense pressure. Here's another detail people overlook. Harry's defensiveness toward the media intensified precisely when his personal life became more complex. Not simpler. Not more stable. More complex. That's not coincidence. When your internal world feels unstable, you often overcompensate by controlling the external narrative. You clamp down. You attack critics. You create enemies because enemies are easier to fight than doubts. And Harry became very good at fighting enemies. But doubts don't respond to lawsuits. They sit quietly. They wait. And they grow. There were moments, captured on camera but rarely analyzed, where Harry appeared physically tense around certain individuals. Not angry. Not hostile. Uneasy. Watch closely and you'll see it. The crossed arms. The tight jaw. The smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Body language experts often say the body speaks when the mind refuses to. And Harry's body was speaking volumes long before his words did. At the same time, Markus Anderson remained consistently present. Not front and center, but always adjacent. Always in proximity. Always connected. That consistency became harder to ignore. Because people come and go from celebrity lives constantly. But those who stay, especially without public roles, usually stay for a reason. Ask yourself this. If someone truly posed no threat to a marriage, would their presence need to be minimized? Would their name need to be avoided? Or would it simply fade into irrelevance? Instead, Markus remained relevant, quietly, which leads to another uncomfortable question. Was Harry protecting his wife? Or was he protecting himself from what he suspected might be true? Silence can serve both purposes. And for years, Harry chose silence. He didn't confront. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand answers. Because confrontation requires certainty. And Harry didn't have that yet. What he had were fragments. Moments that didn't quite fit. Emotional reactions that felt disproportionate. A growing sense that he was being managed rather than partnered. And that's a hard thing to admit, even to yourself. Especially when your entire identity has been reframed as the man who chose love over legacy. What happens when love starts to feel conditional? When partnership starts to feel strategic? When you realize you might be the last person to see what everyone else suspects? That realization doesn't explode. It corrodes. And corrosion takes time. By the time Harry reached his late 30s, the silence had become heavy. Not peaceful. Not calm. Heavy. The kind of silence that follows unanswered questions. The kind that fills rooms even when no one speaks. And still, he didn't say anything. Because speaking would mean acknowledging that the fairy tale he defended so fiercely might have been incomplete. Or worse, misunderstood. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because silence, no matter how disciplined, eventually creates pressure. And pressure always seeks release. Harry didn't break his silence suddenly. He began by loosening it. Allowing ambiguity. Avoiding denials. Choosing words that left space for interpretation. That's not accidental. That's someone testing the waters. Someone seeing what happens when the narrative isn't tightly sealed. And what happened was immediate. People noticed. The tone shifted. The emphasis changed. The omissions became louder than the statements. And that's when the name Markus Anderson started to feel different. No longer just background, but context. And context changes everything. Because once you start asking why someone mattered, not just that they existed, you open a door that can't be closed. And Harry, whether he intended to or not, opened it. Which brings us to the man himself. Who exactly is Markus Anderson? Why did his presence linger when others disappeared? And why do people who understand power dynamics say his role was far more significant than anyone ever admitted? Those answers don't live in headlines. They live in the shadows. And that's where we're going next. Because once you understand who Markus Anderson really is and how he operates, the silence Harry kept for so long starts to make a chilling kind of sense. That question sits at the center of this chapter like a locked door no one wants to open. Because the moment you stop treating Markus Anderson as a background figure and start examining him as a force, the entire story shifts. Not louder, not messier, just clearer. Here's the shocking part most people miss. Markus Anderson didn't become important because of a scandal. He became important because of access. And access is the one currency that never loses value. To understand why his presence mattered, and why it still does, you have to forget the caricature. Forget the tabloid shorthand. Forget the temptation to label him as a villain or a mastermind. Real influence rarely announces itself that way. Real influence operates quietly. Markus Anderson is the kind of person you don't notice until you realize he's been everywhere you needed permission to enter. Private clubs, elite gatherings, invitation-only spaces where reputations are shaped long before headlines are written. He doesn't need to speak publicly because he's already been heard privately. And that distinction is critical. From the outside, Markus looks like a connector. Someone who introduces people, facilitates conversations, smooths social pathways. Harmless. Useful. Invisible enough to avoid scrutiny. But inside elite ecosystems, connectors are rarely neutral. They know who trusts whom. They know who confides what. They know which doors stay closed, and which ones can be opened quietly. And once you understand that, you begin to see why his proximity to Meghan mattered long before Harry ever entered the picture. Markus and Meghan's connection predates royal life. That's not speculation, it's timing. Shared spaces. Overlapping social circles. A familiarity that existed before the pressure cooker of monarchy and media ever came into play. That kind of history creates something powerful. Context. They didn't need to explain themselves to each other. They didn't need to perform. They already spoke the same social language. And when Harry entered that world, he entered as an outsider, despite his title. Ask yourself this: what's more destabilizing, being new to a relationship or being new to a dynamic that already exists within it? Harry wasn't just adapting to Meghan. He was adapting to a network where Markus Anderson was already fluent. That doesn't mean wrongdoing, but it does mean imbalance. Because when one partner shares a deep, pre-existing bond with someone outside the marriage, especially someone skilled at navigating influence, it changes the emotional geometry. And geometry matters. People close to Harry have suggested that Markus possessed a unique ability to remain present without being visible. He didn't dominate conversations. He didn't assert authority. He didn't compete. He listened. That alone can create intimacy. Listening builds trust. Trust builds dependency. Dependency builds leverage, sometimes without anyone intending it. And here's where the story becomes complicated. Markus wasn't just a friend to Meghan. He was a constant, a sounding board, someone who understood her ambitions, frustrations, and grievances without requiring translation. Harry, by contrast, was still learning, still adjusting, still processing the enormity of what he had given up. That difference matters. Because when one partner is in transition and the other has a stable external anchor, power dynamics shift, subtly but unmistakably. Let's pause here and ask a hard question. Is it possible for a third party to become emotionally central to a marriage without crossing any explicit lines? Yes, absolutely. And in many cases, that emotional centrality is more destabilizing than anything physical. If Markus Anderson became, intentionally or not, the person Meghan confided in most deeply, the person who validated her perspective, the person who reinforced her narrative, then his influence extended far beyond casual friendship. And Harry may have sensed that long before he understood it. Here's what insiders describe. Markus had a way of making himself indispensable without appearing intrusive. He didn't demand space. He was offered it. He didn't assert loyalty. He received it. And once someone becomes indispensable, questioning their role feels disruptive, even disloyal. Harry, raised in a world where hierarchy is explicit and boundaries are formal, may not have immediately recognized the informal power Markus wielded. That kind of power doesn't come with titles. It comes with trust. And trust is invisible until it's gone. Consider this. Markus never needed to undermine Harry directly. He never needed to compete. All he had to do was be present when Harry wasn't. Emotionally, psychologically, or physically. And over time, that presence accumulates significance. People who've watched similar dynamics unfold say the warning signs are rarely dramatic. They're quiet. You notice your partner sharing reactions with someone else first. You notice inside jokes you don't understand. You notice decisions being discussed elsewhere before they reach you. None of that proves betrayal, but all of it signals displacement. And displacement hurts more than confrontation. Harry's discomfort with Markus didn't arrive as suspicion. It arrived as unease. A sense that something was slightly misaligned, but not enough to challenge without sounding paranoid. And paranoia is the last thing Harry wanted to project, especially after years of being told his instincts were unreliable, that he was overreacting, that his trauma distorted perception. Imagine trying to trust your gut in that environment. Now add another layer. Markus Anderson is known for discretion, for understanding the value of privacy, for operating in spaces where secrets aren't spilled, they're stored. That reputation alone would make confrontation intimidating. If Harry suspected something, anything, what would accusing Markus accomplish? Public denial? Private deflection? An emotional rupture with Meghan? The cost-benefit analysis doesn't favor impulsiveness. So Harry waited, and Markus stayed. That's the part people underestimate. Time. Time transforms presence into influence. Influence into dependency. Dependency into silence. Because once a dynamic solidifies, disrupting it feels like detonating a carefully balanced structure. And Harry, by all accounts, hates chaos, despite how his life appears. He craves emotional order, predictability, loyalty, which makes this next detail especially telling. When relationships deteriorate, people often pull away from external connections to focus inward. But in this case, Markus's proximity allegedly didn't diminish, it persisted. That persistence is either deeply innocent or deeply significant. Ask yourself, if you were Harry, would you question it? Or would you tell yourself you're imagining things? Most people choose the second option, especially when the alternative threatens everything they've sacrificed. And Harry had sacrificed a lot. Country, family, identity. Admitting a miscalculation now would mean admitting the foundation itself was unstable. That's not a small thing. So he chose patience, observation, silence. And silence, as we've seen, can be strategic. But here's the turning point in this chapter. Because Markus Anderson wasn't just present during the early days. He remained relevant through moments of intense pressure, when narratives were being crafted, when alliances mattered, when trust was currency. That's when Harry's discomfort reportedly intensified, because pressure reveals priorities. Who do you turn to when everything is on the line? Who do you trust with unfiltered thoughts? Who helps shape your version of reality? If the answer isn't your spouse, or if it's shared with someone else, that's a problem. And Harry, slowly, painfully, may have realized that he wasn't the sole emotional partner in his own marriage. Not replaced, but supplemented. And supplementation can feel like erasure. Now, let's be clear again. No one is claiming Markus orchestrated anything. No one is asserting intent. Influence doesn't require intent to be effective. It just requires proximity and trust. And Markus had both. Which brings us to the most unsettling question of this chapter. What if Markus knew Harry would never confront him? What if he understood Harry's psychology well enough to know that silence was the path of least resistance? That doesn't make him a villain, but it does make him powerful. And power, when unacknowledged, becomes dangerous. Harry's silence wasn't just about fear or denial. It was about imbalance. And once imbalance becomes clear, everything that follows begins to feel inevitable. Because the next stage isn't suspicion, it's realization. And realization doesn't happen all at once. It happens in fragments. Moments you replay late at night. Conversations that suddenly sound different in hindsight. Loyalties you reassess with new eyes. And when that process starts, it doesn't stop. The question is no longer whether Markus Anderson mattered. It's how much, and what that meant for Harry. Because once you understand Markus's role, not as a headline, but as a constant, the story stops being about rumor and starts being about dynamics. And dynamics, once exposed, are impossible to ignore. In the next chapter, we're going deeper into the bond between Meghan and Markus, how it formed, why it endured, and why some insiders believe it crossed a line long before anyone noticed. Because when familiarity turns into reliance, and reliance turns into emotional exclusivity, the fallout is never clean. They don't arrive with fireworks or scandal. They don't demand attention. They simply exist, quietly, comfortably, growing stronger in the background while everyone else is distracted by the obvious story. And that's exactly how the Meghan-Markle bond has been described by those who claim to have witnessed it up close. Not loud, not reckless, but persistent. This chapter begins with a question that makes many people uncomfortable. What if the most powerful relationship in this story wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but emotional? Because emotional intimacy doesn't need witnesses. It doesn't need physical proof. It only needs consistency, trust, and shared understanding. And by those measures, the Meghan-Markle bond was unusually strong. Let's rewind to the beginning. Before titles, before royal protocols, before the global scrutiny that would later define Meghan's life. Meghan and Markus existed in overlapping worlds that valued discretion, ambition, and strategic relationships. Worlds where perception mattered as much as reality, and where alliances were formed not just for friendship, but for survival. In those environments, emotional bonds form differently. They're not always about vulnerability in the traditional sense. They're about alignment. About knowing someone understands your goals without you having to spell them out. And that's where Markus allegedly stood apart. According to people familiar with the dynamic, Markus wasn't just someone Meghan spoke to occasionally. He was someone who understood her trajectory, her frustrations, her sense of being underestimated. That kind of understanding can be intoxicating, because being understood, truly understood, often feels more intimate than being loved. Now ask yourself this. If you were navigating a high-pressure transition, surrounded by critics, expectations, and constant judgment, who would you lean on? the person still learning your world, or the person who already knows how to move within it? Harry, for all his loyalty and devotion, was new to Meghan's pre-royal identity. He was still learning the layers of her life that existed before him. Markus, on the other hand, didn't need an introduction. That difference matters more than people realize. Because familiarity creates ease. Ease creates honesty. And honesty creates bonds that feel effortless. People who observed Meghan and Markus together often describe a natural rhythm. Conversations that flowed without friction. Shared humor. An unspoken understanding that didn't require explanation. Again, none of this proves wrongdoing. But it does establish something important. Depth. And depth, when combined with constant access, can quietly outgrow its original boundaries. Harry, meanwhile, was living inside a different kind of pressure cooker. He wasn't just adapting to marriage. He was disentangling himself from an entire institution. That process is emotionally exhausting. When someone is exhausted, they often miss subtle shifts around them. And subtle shifts are where this story lives. Insiders claim there were moments when Meghan sought Markus's counsel before making decisions that directly affected her marriage. Not because Harry was excluded intentionally, but because Markus felt easier to talk to in those moments. That's a critical distinction. Ease doesn't feel like betrayal at first. It feels like relief. But relief, when consistently sourced from the same external person, creates a parallel intimacy. And parallel intimacy is where lines begin to blur. Let's pause and be very clear. This chapter is not claiming a physical affair. It's examining emotional proximity. Because emotional proximity is the foundation upon which everything else is built. If you've ever been in a relationship where your partner had a confidant who knew them better than you did, you know how destabilizing that feels. You start to question your role, your relevance, your access. Harry, according to those close to him, began to feel that shift long before he understood it. He couldn't point to a moment. He couldn't identify a single incident. He just felt peripheral. And that feeling doesn't arrive with accusations. It arrives with self-doubt. Am I imagining this? Am I being insecure? Or is something genuinely off? Harry had been publicly accused of paranoia for years, of seeing threats where none existed, of overreacting. So when his instincts whispered again, he hesitated to listen. That hesitation is important, because it allowed the dynamic to deepen unchecked. Markus's role allegedly expanded during moments of crisis, when criticism intensified, when narratives needed managing, when reassurance was required. In those moments, Markus was steady, predictable, affirming, supportive in ways that didn't challenge Meghan's self-concept. And that kind of support is powerful. Harry's support, by contrast, was complicated. It came with his own emotional needs, his own trauma, his own uncertainties. Loving him meant carrying his history. Markus didn't require that. And sometimes, the absence of burden feels like intimacy. Now consider this from Harry's perspective. You've given up everything for someone. You're fighting the world on their behalf. And yet, when they need grounding, reassurance, or clarity, they turn, instinctively, to someone else. Not because you're inadequate, but because someone else feels easier. That realization cuts deeply. People who've experienced similar dynamics describe it as being slowly edged out of your own relationship, not through betrayal, but through convenience. And convenience is hard to argue against. How do you confront someone for choosing what feels easiest? You can't accuse. You can't prove intent. You can only feel the distance. Harry reportedly felt that distance growing. He noticed that certain conversations happened elsewhere first, that reactions were shared with someone else before being shared with him, that emotional processing occurred in parallel. Again, nothing dramatic, just enough to create a quiet ache. And that ache is often dismissed until hindsight reframes it. Which brings us to a critical turning point in this chapter. Because at some point, the bond between Meghan and Markus allegedly stopped being just historical familiarity and became something more present, more immediate, more emotionally prioritized. That's when Harry's discomfort reportedly sharpened, not into suspicion yet, but into awareness. Awareness that he wasn't the only person who knew his wife deeply. Awareness that he wasn't always the first person she turned to. Awareness that someone else occupied emotional space he assumed was exclusive. That awareness is devastating, especially when you've sacrificed your identity to protect the relationship you're now questioning. Harry didn't confront Meghan directly, not then. According to sources, he internalized it, rationalized it, told himself it was temporary. Stress does strange things to people, he thought. This will pass. But patterns don't pass on their own. They entrench. And the more entrenched the Meghan-Markus bond became, the harder it was for Harry to ignore its implications. Because emotional bonds leave traces. They shape decisions. They influence narratives. They determine whose perspective is validated. And Harry began to feel like his perspective wasn't always the one that mattered most. That realization doesn't spark anger immediately. It sparks grief. Grief for the partnership you thought you had. Grief for the intimacy you assumed was reciprocal. Grief for the certainty that now feels naive. And grief often precedes confrontation. But Harry wasn't ready for confrontation yet. He was still in the observation phase. Watching, listening, replaying interactions in his mind. And the more he replayed them, the more the bond between Meghan and Markus stood out. Not as scandal, but as structure. A structure that existed independently of him. And that's when a frightening thought allegedly surfaced. What if this bond wasn't accidental? What if it served a purpose? That question doesn't accuse. It interrogates. And interrogation is the first step toward truth. Because once you start asking why a dynamic exists, not just that it exists, you can't unask it. Harry, at this stage, still didn't know what to believe. But he knew one thing. Whatever this bond was, it wasn't insignificant. And it wasn't going away. They happen in absences. Not the obvious kind. Not physical disappearances or unexplained trips. But emotional absences. Moments where you realize, too late, that something important occurred without you. And this chapter lives in those moments. Because if the previous chapter was about emotional proximity, this one is about physical and psychological space. About where conversations happened, who was present, and who wasn't. The rooms Harry wasn't in. Let's start with a hard truth. Affairs, especially the kind that don't announce themselves, rarely begin with secrecy. They begin with normalcy, with access that feels justified, with spaces that don't raise alarms because they've always existed. Private rooms, after-hours conversations, quiet corners of social life where expectations loosen and honesty feels safer. Those spaces don't look dangerous at first. They look familiar, and that's exactly why they matter. According to people who claim knowledge of the dynamic, there were environments where Meghan and Markus interacted without Harry, not intentionally excluding him, but naturally bypassing him. Private gatherings, inner circle conversations, moments framed as logistical, strategic, or purely social. Nothing scandalous. Just separate. Now ask yourself this. How many meaningful conversations does it take before separation becomes a pattern? It doesn't take many. Harry, still navigating the emotional fallout of leaving royal life, was often pulled in multiple directions. Meetings, legal strategy, public obligations, emotional processing of his own past. Meanwhile, Meghan's world was accelerating in a different way. New opportunities, new alliances, new pressures to perform, adapt, and control narrative. And Markus was there, consistently, not as a guest, not as an accessory, but as someone who belonged. Belonging is important here. Because when someone belongs in spaces where you feel like a visitor, power dynamics shift, even if no one acknowledges it. Harry reportedly began to notice something subtle but unsettling. Decisions that felt pre-discussed, reactions that seemed pre-processed, responses that suggested conversations had already happened elsewhere. That realization doesn't hit like betrayal. It hits like confusion. Why do I feel like I'm arriving late to my own marriage? That's a terrifying thought, and most people push it away. Harry did too. At first, he told himself it was stress, that everyone was overwhelmed, that not every conversation needed to include him, and that's reasonable. Until it isn't. Because while not every conversation needs to include your spouse, patterns of exclusion, intentional or not, create emotional distance. And emotional distance, left unchecked, becomes emotional replacement. Let's talk about the rooms themselves. These weren't secret hotel suites or clandestine hideaways. They were living rooms, private lounges, back rooms of social clubs, spaces where cameras didn't reach and guards relaxed, spaces where people spoke freely. And freedom changes behavior. People who witnessed interactions in these settings describe a comfort between Meghan and Markus that stood out. Not flirtation. Not obvious intimacy. Ease. The kind of ease that comes from history and repetition. And here's where Harry's absence becomes significant. When you're not present in those spaces, you don't just miss conversations. You miss context, tone, subtext. You miss the way someone's voice softens around another person, the way they lean in, the way their attention shifts. Those details matter, because intimacy isn't declared. It's demonstrated. Harry, according to insiders, would sometimes sense this shift after the fact. He'd enter a room and feel the residue of a conversation that had just ended. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like you interrupted something, even when no one did anything wrong? That feeling is powerful. It tells you that something meaningful occurred without you, and meaning is the real currency here. Now, it's important to note something. There's no claim that Meghan and Markus deliberately orchestrated secrecy. In fact, the dynamic may have felt entirely innocent from the inside. That's often how these things unfold. Emotional lines aren't crossed with awareness. They're crossed with justification. We're just talking. We're just venting. We're just processing. But processing with whom matters. If you process your fears, frustrations, and doubts with someone outside your marriage, especially consistently, you are building an emotional structure that exists independently of your spouse. Harry may not have had the vocabulary for that at first. What he had was discomfort, a sense that something important was happening in rooms he wasn't invited into, or didn't think he needed to be. And that's where this chapter tightens. Because at some point, absence stops being circumstantial and starts feeling structural. People close to Harry say there were instances when he found out about decisions or emotional shifts after they had already been discussed elsewhere. Not maliciously withheld, but not shared proactively either. That distinction is brutal, because it's not betrayal you can confront. It's marginalization you're expected to accept. And Harry, for a long time, accepted it. Why? Because confronting it would require admitting vulnerability, admitting insecurity, admitting that the marriage he defended publicly might have internal fractures he didn't know how to address. And Harry hates appearing weak, especially after years of being framed as unstable, reactive, or overly sensitive. So he stayed quiet. He observed. He noted patterns. And those patterns began to tell a story where Markus wasn't just present, but influential, where Meghan sought emotional calibration outside the marriage, where Harry's role shifted subtly from partner to participant. That shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens conversation by conversation, decision by decision, room by room. And here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because once Harry started noticing the rooms he wasn't in, he began questioning why he wasn't in them. Was it because he was busy? Was it because he was emotionally unavailable? Or was it because his presence complicated dynamics that flowed more smoothly without him? That question is devastating, because it forces you to consider the possibility that your absence isn't accidental, it's convenient. Harry didn't want to believe that, so he looked for alternative explanations. Markus is just a friend. They've known each other longer. I'm projecting. And those explanations worked, for a while, until they didn't. Because the rooms kept multiplying. Not physically, but symbolically. Text threads he wasn't part of. Shared jokes he didn't understand. References that required explanation. Those are emotional rooms too. And Harry wasn't in them either. People often assume affairs require secrecy. Locked phones, hidden messages, sudden schedule changes. But emotional displacement doesn't need secrecy. It thrives on openness. Because when everything is technically visible, there's nothing to accuse. And that's the most disorienting part. Harry wasn't dealing with lies. He was dealing with omission. And omission is harder to confront because it doesn't break rules, it bypasses them. As time went on, insiders claim Harry's discomfort evolved into something sharper. Not suspicion, awareness. Awareness that his emotional access was no longer exclusive. Awareness that someone else occupied space he assumed was reserved for him. Awareness that conversations shaping his marriage might be happening elsewhere. And that awareness changes everything. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Harry reportedly began replaying interactions in his mind. Moments that felt insignificant at the time, but now carried new weight. Why did that conversation end when I walked in? Why did that decision feel predetermined? Why did my reaction feel secondary? Those questions don't accuse. They haunt. And haunting questions don't go away just because you ignore them. Now, here's where this chapter intersects with something deeper. Harry's life had already been defined by rooms he wasn't allowed into, meetings he wasn't part of, decisions made without him. He left that world to escape that feeling. And now, according to those close to him, he was feeling it again, inside his own marriage. That parallel is brutal. It triggers old wounds, old insecurities, old fears of being sidelined. And when old wounds reopen, reactions intensify. Harry didn't explode. He imploded. He withdrew further. He became quieter, more guarded, which, ironically, may have deepened the very dynamic that unsettled him. Because emotional withdrawal creates vacuum, and vacuums get filled by whoever is present. Markus was present, consistently, comfortably, and without the emotional baggage Harry carried. That doesn't make him malicious, but it does make him central. And centrality is the line most people don't realize they've crossed until it's too late. This chapter isn't about accusing anyone of sneaking around. It's about recognizing that intimacy is built in spaces, and those spaces matter. Harry wasn't in those rooms. And eventually, he stopped pretending that didn't bother him. Because when you realize you're not present where your relationship is being shaped, the fear isn't infidelity. It's irrelevance. And irrelevance is a slow, silent killer of trust. By the end of this phase, Harry reportedly felt something he hadn't felt before. Not anger, not jealousy, a quiet dread. The sense that whatever was happening had already taken shape, and that confronting it now might be too late. Because once emotional structures exist outside the marriage, dismantling them isn't simple. It requires honesty, disruption, and a willingness to face answers you might not want. Harry wasn't ready for that yet, but readiness was coming. Because the next stage wasn't about absence. It was about signs, red flags he had ignored, moments he dismissed, instincts he overruled. And once those red flags lined up, denial became impossible. There's a moment in every unraveling story where hindsight becomes cruel, where the things you once brushed aside line up neatly and refuse to be ignored. This chapter lives in that moment. Because red flags don't arrive waving banners. They arrive disguised as inconveniences, as misunderstandings, as moments you explain away because acknowledging them would require courage you're not sure you have yet. And Harry ignored many of them. Not because he was foolish, but because he was invested. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't like admitting. The more you sacrifice for a relationship, the harder it becomes to question it. And Harry sacrificed everything. Country, family, identity, a future that had been written for him since birth. When you've given up that much, your brain will do almost anything to avoid the possibility that the foundation itself might be unstable. That's where denial becomes self-preservation. The first red flags weren't dramatic. They never are. They were tonal. Shifts in how conversations unfolded. Changes in emotional availability. Moments where reassurance felt rehearsed rather than instinctive. Harry reportedly noticed that when he raised concerns, however gently, the response was often deflection rather than engagement. You're overthinking. You're projecting. You're stressed. Those phrases are subtle, but repeated often enough, they train you to doubt your instincts. And Harry had already spent years being told his instincts were unreliable. That context matters. Because when someone has been conditioned to mistrust their own perception, red flags don't register as warnings. They register as personal flaws. Maybe I am being paranoid. Maybe this is my trauma talking. Maybe I'm the problem. That internal dialogue is corrosive. Another red flag came in the form of emotional timing. Harry noticed that certain emotional reactions, anger, relief, excitement, were often processed elsewhere first. By the time they reached him, they were already refined, filtered, less raw. That might sound minor, but it's not. Raw emotion is intimacy. Filtered emotion is presentation. If your partner brings you their processed feelings instead of their unfiltered ones, it means the raw version happened somewhere else. And Harry felt that shift. But again, he rationalized it. She's overwhelmed. She needs space. This phase will pass. He told himself these things because the alternative was unbearable. Then there were the micro moments. The phone glances. The quick smiles that appeared and vanished. The energy shift when certain messages arrived. None of it was obvious enough to accuse, but all of it accumulated. Think of it like this. One drop of water doesn't flood a room, but enough drops, over time, will destroy the foundation. Harry's discomfort wasn't triggered by a single incident. It was triggered by accumulation. And accumulation is harder to confront because it doesn't give you a clear starting point. Where do you begin? Do you say, I feel like I'm not the first person you talk to anymore? Do you say, I feel like someone else understands you better than I do? Those aren't accusations. They're admissions of vulnerability. And vulnerability is risky when you're not sure how it will be received. According to people close to Harry, when he did attempt to express unease, even in softened language, it was often reframed as stress or insecurity, which, again, isn't inherently malicious. But it is deflective, and deflection delays resolution. Another red flag appeared in decision-making. Harry reportedly felt that certain choices were presented as conclusions rather than discussions, as if the debate had already occurred, and he was being briefed rather than consulted. That's a devastating realization for a partner, because partnership implies shared deliberation. When deliberation happens elsewhere, partnership erodes. Harry noticed this pattern particularly during moments of external pressure, when the media narrative intensified, when strategic decisions mattered most. Those were moments when alignment was crucial. And yet, he felt slightly out of step, always reacting, rarely initiating. That imbalance didn't make him angry. It made him quiet. Which brings us to another red flag he ignored: his own withdrawal. Harry began spending more time alone. More time in reflection, less time engaging emotionally. He told himself he was protecting the relationship by not escalating tension. But in reality, he was creating space. And space, as we've seen, gets filled. He didn't realize at the time that his silence might be reinforcing the very dynamic that unsettled him. That realization came later. Much later. There was also the issue of loyalty tests. Not explicit ones, subtle ones. Moments where Harry felt compelled to defend decisions he didn't fully agree with, to support narratives that didn't feel entirely authentic to him. That internal conflict is exhausting, because loyalty should feel affirming, not constricting. When loyalty starts to feel like performance, something is wrong. Harry reportedly felt that pressure increasing. Defend harder. Question less. Trust more. But trust doesn't grow under pressure. It withers. And the more Harry felt pressured to perform loyalty, the more his private doubts intensified. That contradiction is important. Public certainty paired with private uncertainty is a volatile mix. Another red flag came from how conflict was handled or avoided. Harry noticed that certain topics were easier to discuss with others than with him. That conversations he found difficult were navigated smoothly elsewhere. That's not betrayal, but it is displacement. And displacement is often the precursor to deeper fractures. At some point, Harry began to sense that addressing his concerns directly might destabilize more than it resolved. That fear kept him quiet, because when you suspect that the truth might blow everything apart, silence feels safer, even if it's suffocating. Here's where hindsight becomes cruel. Looking back, Harry reportedly realized that many of these red flags weren't isolated. They were interconnected. Emotional filtering, decision displacement, deflection of concerns, persistent external reliance. Individually, they were manageable. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are hard to unsee once recognized. But recognition didn't happen overnight. It crept in, during quiet moments, late at night, in the spaces between public obligations. Harry would replay conversations in his mind, not obsessively, but reflexively. Why did that feel off? Why did that reaction seem predecided? Why did I feel like an observer in that moment? Those questions don't demand answers. They demand honesty. And honesty, at this stage, was terrifying, because answering them honestly meant acknowledging that something fundamental might be wrong. And Harry wasn't ready for that yet. So he ignored the red flags. Or rather, he minimized them. He told himself every marriage has phases. Every partnership has imbalances. Every stressful period creates distortions. And he's right. But not every marriage leaves one partner feeling emotionally peripheral. That's the difference. The red flags Harry ignored weren't about infidelity. They were about priority, about who held emotional centrality. And that's a far more painful thing to confront. Because you can forgive a mistake. But how do you forgive being slowly edged out? By the time Harry began approaching his 40s, the red flags had stacked too high to ignore completely. They hadn't yet crystallized into certainty. But they had eroded trust. And eroded trust doesn't collapse loudly. It collapses quietly, which is exactly what happened next. Because after denial comes realization. Not explosive realization, but a moment, sometimes small, sometimes seemingly insignificant, that reframes everything that came before it. And that moment, according to insiders, arrived unexpectedly. Not in an argument, not in a confession, but in a realization so subtle it took Harry days to fully understand it. And once he did, there was no going back. Because the next chapter isn't about red flags anymore. It's about the moment Harry claims everything shifted. The moment denial cracked. The moment he stopped asking, "Am I imagining this?" and started asking, "What am I not seeing?" And that question changes everything. What if loyalty itself became a form of leverage? That question sits uncomfortably at the center of this chapter. Because this isn't where the story turns explosive. It's where it turns psychological, strategic, quietly dangerous. This is the chapter where everything Harry thought loyalty meant began to feel conditional. And conditional loyalty cuts deeper than betrayal. Let's begin with a hard truth. In healthy relationships, loyalty flows both ways. Freely, without being demanded, without being tested, without being weaponized. But when loyalty starts to feel like something you have to constantly prove, something has shifted. And according to people close to Harry, that shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in gradually, masked as unity, survival, and shared purpose. At first, loyalty looked noble. Stand together. Protect each other. Defend the narrative at all costs. Harry embraced that fully, maybe too fully, because when you're fighting external enemies, loyalty feels heroic, necessary, even romantic. But here's the problem. When loyalty becomes absolute, it leaves no room for dissent. And dissent is where truth lives. Over time, Harry reportedly noticed that expressing doubt, even gently, was met with resistance. Not open conflict, not shouting, something subtler, disappointment, emotional withdrawal, a sense that questioning the narrative was equivalent to betrayal. That's not partnership, that's pressure, and pressure changes behavior. Harry began to self-edit, to soften concerns before voicing them, to choose silence over friction, to prioritize harmony over honesty. Again, none of this proves malice, but it does establish imbalance. Because when one partner controls the emotional temperature of a relationship, the other partner adapts to avoid triggering discomfort. And adaptation can quickly become submission. Now, let's talk about Markus's role in this dynamic. Because this is where his presence allegedly became more than just emotional proximity. According to insiders, Markus was often positioned, intentionally or not, as a validator. Someone who reinforced Meghan's perspective, affirmed her instincts, and supported her decisions without hesitation. That kind of validation is powerful, especially when it's consistent. Especially when it contrasts with a partner who, by virtue of being human, sometimes asks questions. Harry's questions weren't accusatory. They weren't hostile. They were born out of uncertainty. But uncertainty is inconvenient when you're trying to maintain control. And so, gradually, uncertainty was reframed. As negativity, as weakness, as emotional baggage. Harry felt that shift. He began to sense that his doubts were not welcome, not because they were wrong, but because they disrupted alignment. And alignment had become sacred. Here's where loyalty turns into leverage. When one partner feels responsible for maintaining emotional stability, they become easier to manage. Harry, desperate to preserve the relationship he had sacrificed everything for, became hyper-aware of how his reactions were perceived. He didn't want to be difficult. He didn't want to be unstable. He didn't want to confirm the worst stereotypes about himself. So he complied. He defended decisions he didn't fully agree with. He echoed narratives that didn't fully resonate. He swallowed discomfort in the name of unity. And each time he did, the imbalance deepened. Because the more you suppress your own truth, the more power you give to someone else's. Markus, in this context, wasn't just a confidant. He became a stabilizer, someone who helped keep Meghan emotionally anchored, especially when Harry's doubts surfaced. That triangulation is subtle but potent. Because when one partner feels emotionally validated elsewhere, they may become less tolerant of emotional complexity at home. Harry's concerns, instead of being explored, were allegedly compared, implicitly or explicitly, to Markus's unwavering support. And that comparison is devastating. Not because Markus did anything overtly wrong, but because Harry could never compete with someone who didn't carry his emotional history. Markus didn't bring trauma into the room. He didn't bring royal baggage. He didn't bring unresolved grief. He brought affirmation. And affirmation feels good. So when tensions arose, it became easier to lean toward the person who made things feel simple. That's not betrayal. That's human nature. But human nature, left unchecked, can hollow out a marriage. Harry reportedly began to feel like his loyalty was expected, but not reciprocated in the same way. He was expected to defend, protect, and endure. But when he needed reassurance, patience, or space to process, those needs felt inconvenient. And that's a dangerous imbalance. Because loyalty that only flows one way isn't loyalty. It's obligation. And obligation breeds resentment. Harry didn't express that resentment outwardly. He internalized it. He told himself he was being supportive. That sacrifice was part of love. That discomfort was temporary. But the body knows what the mind tries to deny. Harry became more withdrawn, more introspective, less emotionally expressive, which, ironically, made him easier to sideline. Because people who don't assert themselves get interpreted as being fine. And Harry wasn't fine. He was exhausted. Exhausted from fighting the world. Exhausted from defending a narrative. Exhausted from suppressing doubt. And in that exhaustion, the leverage became clearer. The more he complied, the more compliance was expected. The more he stayed silent, the more silence became the norm. And silence, as we've seen, is fertile ground for imbalance. At some point, according to insiders, Harry began to realize something deeply unsettling. His loyalty was being used not just to protect the relationship, but to maintain control over it. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with sadness. Because once you see loyalty as leverage, you can't unsee it. Every request feels loaded. Every expectation feels conditional. Every disagreement feels dangerous. Harry reportedly began questioning whether his role in the marriage had shifted from equal partner to emotional buffer. Someone who absorbed tension so others didn't have to. Someone whose discomfort was less important than maintaining stability. And that's not love. That's containment. Now, let's be careful here. This doesn't mean Meghan was consciously manipulating Harry. Dynamics like this often emerge unconsciously, especially under extreme pressure. But unconscious patterns still cause real harm. And Harry was feeling that harm. He began to notice that moments of vulnerability were often redirected. That emotional conversations were reframed as problems to solve rather than feelings to explore. That's a subtle form of invalidation. And when it happens repeatedly, it teaches you to stop opening up. Harry stopped sharing fully. He became guarded, which only reinforced the idea that Markus, steady, affirming, uncomplicated, was the easier emotional option. That cycle is brutal, because the more you withdraw, the more you're perceived as distant. And the more distant you appear, the more others fill the emotional gaps. Harry found himself trapped in that loop. And loops are hard to break, especially when breaking them requires confrontation. And confrontation, at this stage, felt catastrophic. Because confronting the dynamic would mean questioning not just one relationship, but the entire life he had rebuilt around it. That's a terrifying prospect. So Harry did what many people do in similar situations. He waited. He observed. He hoped clarity would arrive on its own. But clarity rarely arrives without disruption. And disruption was coming. Because leverage only works as long as the person being leveraged doesn't fully understand what's happening. Once they do, everything changes. Harry's understanding didn't arrive in a dramatic argument or a shocking revelation. It arrived quietly, in a moment of realization that reframed everything he had tolerated. A moment when he understood that his loyalty had been assumed, not cherished. That his silence had been convenient, not healing. And that realization marked the end of denial. Because once you recognize leverage, you can no longer pretend you're choosing freely. You're choosing under pressure. And Harry, at that point, began to question whether he could continue doing that. Which brings us to the moment insiders say everything shifted. The moment Harry stopped absorbing tension and started paying attention to it. The moment he realized that something had already changed and that avoiding it any longer would only cost him more. Because the next chapter isn't about dynamics anymore. It's about the moment Harry